There is a place in the eastern part of America where the mountains seem to breathe. In the early hours, before the light has fully arrived, a pale haze gathers in the valleys and drifts upward through the trees, soft and slow, the way breath rises from something sleeping. The ridges hold names older than the country itself. The forest is so deep and so old that in places it has never been cut. And beneath all of it, beneath the roots and the soil and the patient grey stone, there is something that the millions of people who visit these mountains every year almost never hear about. They come for the views, they come for the quiet, they walk the trails and photograph the waterfalls and drive home again, and very few of them ever learn that for more than 100 years, in quiet corners of old libraries and in the footnotes of forgotten reports, people have been arguing about what lies underneath. Tonight, we're going to go down there, slowly, gently, in the dark, into one of the strangest and most stubborn mysteries in the eastern mountains. The mystery of the tunnels beneath the Smokies. If you have found your way here because you are trying to fall asleep, then you are exactly where you are meant to be. This is what I make these videos for. So before we begin, if you feel like it, take a moment to subscribe, but only if these quiet journeys are genuinely something you enjoy. And here is the part I love the most. Leave a comment and tell me where in the world you are listening from, and what time it is for you right now. It is a strange and lovely thing to think about. All of us scattered across the whole turning planet, in different cities and different time zones. Some of you just getting into bed, some of you awake in the small dark hours, all of us drifting toward the same quiet place together tonight. So tell me where you are. I read them, and there is something comforting in seeing the map of us fill in, one sleepy voice at a time. Now let the lights go low, settle into the pillow, let your breathing slow, and let us walk together, softly, into the blue smoke. There is a particular kind of mystery that behaves differently from an ordinary question. An ordinary question has an answer waiting somewhere, patient and findable. You look in the right place, you ask the right person, you open the right book, and the answer is simply there where it always was. But some mysteries do not work like that at all. Some mysteries do not shrink as you study them. They grow. Every piece of evidence you gather, instead of narrowing things down, opens 2 more doors. Every answer arrives holding a new question by the hand. The deeper you go, the larger and stranger the thing becomes, until you realize that you're no longer solving a puzzle. You're exploring a country. The tunnels beneath the Smoky Mountains are exactly that kind of mystery. And so the honest place to begin is not with an answer, it is with a confession. We do not fully know what is down there. We are not even entirely sure how the story starts. And that uncertainty, that soft and open not knowing, is precisely the thing that has kept this question alive for so long, refusing to be solved and refusing to disappear. So let us begin where the mountains themselves begin, which is to say, almost unimaginably long ago. Because to understand what people have claimed lies beneath these mountains, you first have to understand the mountains, and to understand the mountains, you have to let go of the ordinary human sense of time entirely. The Smokies are not young mountains. They are not sharp and dramatic and freshly born like the great ranges of the West. They are old. They are worn soft and round by an amount of time that the mind genuinely cannot hold. And whatever rests inside them has been resting there, in the dark and the silence, for longer than almost anything else we will ever talk about. Keep that in your mind as we go, the age of the stone. Because in this story, time is not just a backdrop. Time is the thing that hid everything. And time, perhaps, is the only thing that will ever give it back. The Great Smoky Mountains rise along the border between Tennessee and North Carolina, a long blue wall folded into the southern end of the Appalachian Range. And the Appalachians are among the oldest mountains on the face of the earth. When they first rose, pushed up by the slow collision of ancient land masses, there were no flowering plants anywhere in the world. There were no birds. The great age of the dinosaurs had not yet even begun. These mountains were already ancient when the dinosaurs were young, and they were already worn down and weathered by the time the dinosaurs vanished. Everything you have ever heard of in human history, every city, every empire, every name, has happened in the very last thin sliver of these mountains' existence. They were here before all of it. They will be here, in some softened form, long after all of it is gone. That is the kind of patience we are dealing with. That is the timescale on which this mystery rests. And the rock itself is a clue, so hold on to this because it matters later. Much of the Smokies is made of what geologists call metamorphic rock. Stone that was once one thing, sand or mud or sediment laid down at the bottom of vanished seas, and then was buried, crushed, heated, and slowly transformed into something harder and stranger over hundreds of millions of years. This is not the soft, easily dissolved limestone that forms the famous show caves you may have toured on a family trip. It is tougher, more complicated stone, threaded through with fractures and seams and the occasional band of softer rock running through it like a vein. Why does that matter? Because the kind of caves and passages that form in this kind of rock are different. They are narrower, more irregular, more three-dimensional, and in some cases they can run for enormous distances, following the hidden cracks in the mountain like roots following water. We will come back to that. For now, just remember. The mountain is not solid. It never was. It is laced through with hollow places, and it always has been. The Cherokee people lived in and around these mountains for a very, very long time before any European ever set eyes on them. Thousands of years, long enough that the land was not simply where they lived. It was woven into who they were, and the Cherokee had a name for the Smokies, a name that carried the feeling of the place. It meant more or less the place of the blue smoke. You have probably seen that smoke yourself, or pictures of it. That soft bluish haze that hangs over the ridges in the morning and never quite seems to lift. Here is something lovely and true about it. It is not smoke at all. There is no fire. The haze is made by the forest itself. The countless trees and plants release tiny amounts of natural compounds into the air, and those compounds catch and scatter the light in a way that turns the distance a soft, smoky blue. The mountain breathes out the breath of the living forest, and it looks from a distance exactly like something is burning slowly somewhere out of sight. Hold on to that image too. Something that looks like smoke, but is not. Something that looks like a fire you cannot find. It is, in its way, the perfect emblem for everything we're about to explore. Because the Cherokee did not only have a name for these mountains, they had stories. Specific stories, carried down through many generations by word of mouth, long before anyone wrote anything down, and some of those stories were about exactly the thing we're here to talk about tonight. They spoke of places in the mountains where the earth was not solid, where openings in the rock led downward into the dark, where passages ran beneath the ridges, and where beings who were not quite people, and not quite anything else, were said to have made their homes, long, long before the first Cherokee ancestor that anyone could remember. Now here is where it would be very easy to make a mistake. It would be easy, with a modern and slightly arrogant ear, to file these away as myths. Just stories. Charming, but not to be taken seriously. But I want you to set that reflex aside tonight, because the relationship between these stories and the actual landscape may be far stranger and far more grounded than that lazy dismissal allows. Here is why. When a culture carries information about places, about geography, about the actual physical shape of the world, in the form of spoken story passed from elder to child across generations, that information can stay astonishingly accurate for an astonishingly long time. This is not a romantic idea, it is something researchers have actually documented. In Australia, for example, scholars have found that the oral traditions of some Aboriginal communities appear to describe coastlines and landscape features as they existed more than 10,000 years ago, before the seas rose at the end of the last ice age and swallowed huge stretches of land that are now far beneath the ocean. Stories that contained, encoded in narrative, a memory of a world that no living person had seen for hundreds of generations. And those stories were right. The drowned coastlines they described matched what the seafloor actually shows. So when people who lived inside these mountains for thousands of years said, with specificity, that there were passages beneath them, and when certain elders could gesture toward a particular ridge or a particular creek valley and say, "There, that is one of the places that deserves something far better than a polite and sceptical smile. It deserves to be taken seriously as what it might actually be. A memory, a map, drawn not on paper, but in words, and handed down through the dark of countless nights very much like this one." So the stories are old, older than the country, but the stories are not the only thread. Because once Europeans began moving into these mountains, in the 1700s and the early 1800s, a strange thing started to happen. Every so often, in the margins of letters, in the offhand notes of surveyors, in the half-remembered tales of early settlers, the same kind of detail would surface. Not a grand announcement, not a headline, just a quiet aside dropped into the middle of some other story, almost as if the person telling it was slightly embarrassed to mention it at all. They would describe finding an opening in the rock, a passage. And again, what made them pause, what made them bother to write it down, was that the passage did not seem entirely natural. I want to be very careful and very honest with you here, because this is exactly the place where this kind of story usually goes wrong. These early accounts are difficult things. Many of them survive only as references to references, a mention in a later document of an earlier document that no one can quite locate anymore. A family story written down a generation after the person who supposedly had the experience had already died. We cannot hold most of them up to the light and verify them the way a historian would want to, so I am not going to tell you that any single one of them is proven. What I can tell you is what the accounts, taken together, tend to say, and what they tend to say is oddly consistent. They describe passages wide enough for two people to walk side by side. They describe walls that felt smoother than weather, and water should have left them. They describe faint markings that the writer could not identify and could not explain. And, strangest of all, several of them describe the same uncanny detail. The air. They say the air moving out of these openings was warmer than it should have been. Warmer than the cool, even breath of an ordinary cave, as if somewhere far down in the dark the mountain was holding heat. There is a phrase that drifts through some of the older accounts that has never quite been explained, and it has the particular weight of something real precisely because no one has been able to make it mean anything tidy. According to several of these stories, the Cherokee had names for the entrances to the passages. In some tellings they were called, more or less, the Old Doors, and there is a fragment, passed along in more than one version, of a Cherokee guide leading a small party of settlers up to the mouth of one of these old doors, and then, before they could go far inside, growing suddenly uneasy and leading them back out again. When the settlers asked why, the answer that survives, worn smooth by retelling, was something close to this. It is not safe in the dying season. And then nothing more. No explanation of what the dying season was, or why it mattered, or what waited inside that made it dangerous at one time of year and not another. The settlers did not understand it. And in all the years since, no one has been able to explain it either. It simply sits there in the record, a closed door of its own, a phrase pointing at knowledge that the people writing it down did not possess, and that we still do not possess tonight. Now, before we let our imaginations run too far down into that dark, we need to stop and be fair. Because there is a perfectly ordinary explanation sitting right beside the extraordinary one, and any honest journey through this mystery has to give it equal time. Here it is. The Appalachian Mountains are full of caves, genuinely, abundantly, unremarkably full of them. The broader region contains some of the most extensive natural cave systems in all of North America. A few hundred miles to the northwest lies Mammoth Cave in Kentucky, the longest cave system known anywhere on Earth, with hundreds of miles of mapped passages winding through the rock. To the east lie places like Luray Caverns in Virginia, vast and beautiful and visited by enormous crowds every year. The geology of this whole region simply produces caves on a grand scale. Underground rivers, hidden chambers, long natural passages carved out over millions of years by patient water. So the mere existence of openings and passages and hollow places beneath the Smokies is not strange at all. It is exactly what you would expect. It would be far stranger if there were no caves down there. So let us be precise about what the real question actually is, because if we are not precise, we will end up arguing about the wrong thing. The question is not whether there are passages beneath the Smoky Mountains. There are. That is settled ordinary geology. The question, the real one, the one that has refused to die for more than a century, is narrower and far more interesting than that. It is this. Among all those natural passages, are there some that show signs of having been changed by human hands? Shaped, widened, smoothed, connected, used, and if so, by whom and how long ago? And here, the honest answer is the one that should make you lean in rather than relax. We do not know, the evidence is genuinely unclear, and the strange, almost unbelievable truth is that the things that could settle the question, the careful surveys, the proper investigations, the patient scientific looking, have only ever been done in scattered pieces by the wrong people, in the wrong way, or in many cases never done at all. To understand why no one ever truly looked, and to understand what the Cherokee themselves believed was down there, we have to talk about a tradition that is not obscure at all. It is one of the most beautifully documented pieces of Cherokee belief that exists. It concerns a people called the Nunnehi. Say it softly to yourself, the Nunnehi. The name is often translated as the people who live anywhere, or sometimes the travellers, and the moment you hear those translations, something interesting is already happening. Because these are not described as ghosts. They are not spirits in the thin, drifting way that word usually suggests to a modern ear. In the Cherokee telling, the Nunnehi were a people, fully real, fully physical. You could meet one, you could speak with one, they could help you, and in the old stories they often did. But they were not quite like ordinary human beings. They didn't age and die the way people do. They knew things people did not know. They could appear and disappear. And most important for our purposes tonight, they were said to live underground, in great towns, beneath the mountains and beneath the rivers, in a whole world that existed parallel to the surface one, hidden in the dark just out of reach. This is not a fringe legend dug up by some late-night theorist. We know about the Nunnehi in detail largely because of a man named James Mooney, who in the late 1800s worked as an ethnographer for the Smithsonian. He spent years living among the Cherokee, listening, recording, taking their knowledge seriously at a time when almost no one in his profession did. The book he produced, gathering the myths and traditions of the Cherokee, remains to this day a foundational source, cited and respected across more than a century of scholarship. And Mooney did not treat the Nunnehi as a quaint fairy tale. He recorded carefully that the Cherokee people he spoke with described the underground towns of the Nunnehi as real places, places with locations, places that certain people were said to have visited or to have known how to find. The stories were specific. They placed the Nunnehi towns beneath particular peaks, beneath particular bends in particular rivers. This was not a vague otherworld floating somewhere beyond the sky. It was here. It was underfoot. It was, in the deepest sense, geography. And here is the gap. Here is the thing that once you see it, you cannot unsee. We have, on one side, a richly documented tradition that says there are inhabited places beneath these mountains, described with real geographic detail, and we have, on the other side, a scattered but persistent body of physical accounts, the settlers and the surveyors and the strange warm passages, that say there are unusual openings in the rock in roughly the same kinds of places. Two completely different sources, arriving from completely different directions, pointing at the same dark beneath the same mountains, and almost no one has ever stood in the middle and asked the obvious question. What if these two bodies of knowledge are describing the same thing? What if the oral tradition and the physical evidence are not two separate curiosities, but two halves of a single map, drawn by two different hands? That question is so natural, so almost childlike in its directness, that you would expect it to have been asked and answered long ago. It has not. And the reason it has not is one of the saddest and most revealing parts of this entire story. To understand that reason, you have to understand something uncomfortable about how the history of this continent came to be written. For most of the 1800s, there was a powerful and deliberate effort by many of the leading scientists and thinkers and politicians of the day to prove something that was not true. They wanted to prove that the native peoples of North America were simply incapable of building anything impressive. And this was a problem for them because the land was covered in impressive things. There were enormous earthen mounds across the river valleys. There were vast geometric earthworks, perfect circles and squares laid out across the landscape on a scale that took your breath away. There were sophisticated stone structures in the southwest. The evidence of complex, organised, ambitious human work was everywhere. So what did they do? They invented other builders. They credited these works to almost anyone except the ancestors of the people who were actually living there. Lost tribes, ancient travellers from across the ocean, a vanished superior race that had supposedly come and gone before the natives arrived. Anyone. Anyone at all, so long as it was not the indigenous peoples of America. This was not an innocent mistake, and it was not subtle. It was useful. It was useful in a very dark and specific way. If you could convince yourself that the people living on the land had not really built anything, had not really shaped or invested in or belonged to the land in any deep way, then it became much easier to justify taking the land away from them. The argument ran straight from the lecture hall to the policy. They did not build it. Therefore they do not truly possess it, therefore it is available to those who will. The fight over who built the great earthworks, what historians now call the Mound Builder controversy, was eventually settled, and settled correctly. By the end of the 1800s, careful work proved beyond any reasonable doubt that the mounds and earthworks were built by the ancestors of the native peoples who were there all along. The lost race was a fantasy, but the habits of mind that the fantasy had created did not vanish when the argument ended. They lingered. They settled into the foundations of American archaeology like damp into a wall. And one of those lingering habits was a deep, reflexive reluctance to credit native North Americans with the more ambitious kinds of construction, especially anything underground, which is, of course, precisely the kind of thing we're here to talk about tonight. So that is the climate in which the tunnel question was born and abandoned. It did not get disproven. That is the crucial thing to understand. It did not get investigated and then dismissed. It simply got set down. It fell into the cracks of a discipline that was organised around other priorities and quietly trained to look away from exactly this kind of question. It became a footnote, a curiosity, the sort of thing a serious researcher might find privately fascinating but would never risk a career pursuing. And so the looking, what little of it there has been, fell to other people, amateurs, enthusiasts, retired engineers and curious locals with surveying equipment and long weekends and a stubborn refusal to let the question go. People with no institutional backing, no funding, no laboratory, and therefore no real way to make the world pay attention to whatever they found. I want to be honest with you about these amateur investigations, because honesty is the whole point of how we're doing this. They are not proof of anything. The people involved often lacked the specific training to tell the difference between a passage shaped by human hands and a passage shaped by water and pressure and time, which in this kind of rock can be a genuinely difficult thing to tell apart even for experts. Their reports were self-published, or printed in small magazines devoted to unconventional history, the kind of outlets that do not put a claim through the rigorous checking that real science demands. So everything I am about to describe comes with that warning attached in large letters. These are claims, not confirmed facts. Hold them loosely. But here is the thing. Even held loosely, they are interesting, because the people making them, working separately in different decades in different parts of the mountains, kept describing the same handful of features. And that pattern is harder to wave away than any single claim. They claimed to find passages whose walls met the floor at a consistent, deliberate-looking angle, more regular than they felt natural fracturing should produce. They claimed to find stretches of floor that were oddly smooth, smoother than the rough, irregular surfaces that this particular kind of metamorphic rock usually breaks into when nature is the only sculptor. They claimed, in a few cases, to find passages that ran in a straight line and held a steady depth for a surprisingly long way, which is not what you would expect from natural cracks, since natural cracks tend to wander and follow the hidden grain and stress lines of the rock. And in the most striking claims of all, the ones that should make you most cautious precisely because they are so dramatic, a few people reported finding what looked to them like a doorway, an opening framed in the rock, a shaped threshold, something that, if it were truly what they thought it was, would not be a natural feature at all. It would be architecture. It would be unmistakable evidence of building deep inside the mountain by someone at some time we cannot name. Now sit with the strangeness of what happens next, because this is the part that, the more you think about it, the stranger it gets. If someone reported finding a possible doorway carved into the rock inside a remote passage, the obvious response, the response that any curious civilization should have, is to send someone qualified to go and look, to check, to confirm, or to gently disprove. And the locations were often described well enough that a properly equipped team could in principle find them again. The Smoky Mountains, for all their fame, for all their millions of visitors, contain vast stretches of wilderness where almost no human being ever sets foot. A passage in one of those stretches could be reached, examined, photographed, measured, and settled by a team of professionals over a few days of careful work. And yet, again and again, that work was simply never done. Not because it was impossible, not because the place could not be found, but because no one with the authority and the resources to settle the question ever decided that it was worth their while to try. The claim would surface. It would ripple briefly through the small world of people who care about such things. And then it would sink again, back into the quiet, unanswered, waiting. There is a particular quality to the geographic detail in the older Cherokee accounts that deserves a closer look, because it is one of the things that keeps thoughtful people from dismissing all of this out of hand. When most cultures around the world tell stories about underground places, the stories tend to be impressionistic. A land of the dead somewhere below, a spirit world reached through the earth, vague, symbolic, dreamlike. But that's not quite how the Smoky Mountains accounts read. They are more specific than that. They describe passages running from a particular slope of a particular ridge down toward the floor of a particular named valley. They describe one passage joining another at a certain depth. They describe the network crossing the high divide of the mountains, from the Tennessee side to the North Carolina side, which is exactly the sort of crossing that the underground drainage of these mountains actually makes, since the water that falls on these peaks does in fact carve its way through and beneath them along hidden routes. In other words, the stories do not describe a vague dream of the underworld. They describe something with the texture of information, the kind of detail you would only bother to remember and pass down if it described a real place that real people once needed to be able to find. If you are still with me, drifting along in the dark, let that be its own small comment in the night. And if at any point your eyes have grown heavy, and you have stopped really listening and started simply floating on the sound of it, that is good. That is exactly what this is for. There is no test at the end. There is only the slow unwinding of a question and the quiet of the mountain and you. So let us keep going down. Because there is another thread to all of this, and it has nothing to do with legends or warm air or doorways glimpsed by candlelight. It is purely practical. It is about something the people of these mountains were genuinely, provably doing on a large scale for thousands of years. They were mining. The Smoky Mountains and the broader Appalachian region around them are rich in certain minerals that were enormously valuable to the native peoples of ancient North America. And one of those minerals is the key to this part of the story. It is a stone called mica. You have almost certainly seen it. It is the rock that splits into thin, flat, shimmering sheets. Sheets so thin you can almost see through them, catching the light like frozen water. To the ancient peoples of this continent, mica was precious. It was beautiful. It was used in ceremony, cut into shapes, placed in the graves of important people, traded across staggering distances. And here is the part that should make you sit up, even half asleep. We know how far it travelled. Archaeologists have found mica from the southern Appalachians at major ceremonial sites hundreds and hundreds of miles away in the great earthwork centres of the Ohio Valley and beyond. The quantities are not small. This was not the occasional lucky trinket carried by a wandering traveller. This was a supply chain, a river of shimmering stone flowing out of these mountains and across half a continent, sustained over centuries, and it flowed in both directions. At sites here in the Smokies, archaeologists have found copper that came all the way from the Great Lakes, and shells that came all the way from the distant ocean coasts. These mountains were not a forgotten backwater on the edge of the world. They were a hub, a crossroads in a vast ancient network of trade that spanned the continent long before any European arrived to notice it. Now follow the simple, almost stubborn logic of it, because it leads somewhere remarkable. If you want to gather mica on that kind of scale, over that kind of time, you eventually run into a problem. You can pick up the loose pieces from the surface for a while, but the surface deposits run out, and then, if you want more, you have to follow the seams of mica down, into the rock, underground. There is no other way. You have to dig, you have to make passages, and mining of all human activities leaves behind some of the most durable evidence there is. It leaves holes, it leaves tunnels, it leaves shaped rock and tool marks and worked surfaces that can last, protected from weather beneath the ground for thousands upon thousands of years. The Cherokee and their ancestors were skilled at this. Their traditions include real knowledge of following mineral seams underground, of keeping the workings from collapsing, of moving air through deep passages so that a person could breathe and work far from the entrance. This is documented. This is not speculation. So here is the question that almost asks itself, and that no one has ever fully answered. If people were mining mica out of these mountains, underground, on an industrial scale, for thousands of years, then where are the mines? Some have been found. There are known, accepted, documented sites in the broader Appalachian mica country that show clear evidence of ancient underground work. Small passages, pits, tool marks bitten into the stone. These are real, and archaeologists acknowledge them. But here is the unsettling part. Almost no one has ever asked how big those workings really were. Whether the small, isolated pieces that have been found are the whole story, or whether they are just the few visible threads of something far larger and far more connected, running deep into the dark. Because the investigations that found those mining sites were not designed to look for a network. They were designed to document individual spots one at a time, and so individual spots are exactly what they found. The larger shape, if there is one, was never mapped, because no one ever went looking for it. The question of whether the ancient mines connect to the passages of the legends, whether the practical and the sacred are in fact the same dark corridors seen from two different angles, sits there, unanswered, in the cool quiet beneath the ridges. There is yet another body of accounts, and this one comes from a completely different kind of source, which is part of what makes it interesting. In the early part of the 20th century, there was a great effort across Appalachia to write down the memories of ordinary people before they were lost. Folklorists wandered the hills with notebooks. Government programs sent collectors out to record the oral histories of people who had grown up in the mountains, who remembered the old days, who carried the stories of their parents and grandparents. And tucked into those collections, scattered through local histories and county records, and the recorded memories of elderly mountain people, the same kind of detail keeps surfacing. Quiet references to caves that the old folks said had been made, not formed. Stories of a grandfather who had found a deep old passage and had been told by a Cherokee neighbour that it was one of many, that they ran all through the mountains like the veins run through a body. Accounts of hunting parties who came upon an opening and looked inside and then, for one reason or another, decided not to go in. Now, taken one at a time, every single one of these can be questioned, and should be. Old memories blur. Stories grow in the telling. A frightened hunter is not a careful scientific instrument. Any one of these accounts, on its own, is the kind of thing a sensible person sets aside with a shrug. But that is not how to weigh them, and here is why. These accounts come from people who did not know each other. They were collected in different places in different decades, from families that had no reason to coordinate, no shared script, no common motive. And if a story is being passed around and embellished, it tends to converge. The details start to match because everyone is borrowing from the same source. But that is not what these accounts do. They vary. The locations are different, the depths are different, the details that caught each person's attention are different, the reactions are different. And that variation, strangely, is the strongest sign that they are real. Because that scattered, inconsistent, everyone saw it a little differently, quality is exactly the signature of many separate people independently bumping into the same kind of thing in different corners of the same vast mountain across the years. And one detail, more than any other, keeps reappearing across all these independent voices, the same one we met at the very beginning. The warmth, the air, witness after witness, separated by decades and miles, describing not the familiar cold of an ordinary cave, but something warmer, something heavier, air that felt, as one description put it, more complex, not the clean mineral cold of stone and water, but something else. Now there is a perfectly sober reason a passage might be warmer than expected, and it is worth knowing because the sober explanation is in some ways more remarkable than a spooky one. An ordinary cave, an isolated pocket in the rock, tends to settle to the average yearly temperature of the region around it, which in these mountains is cool, somewhere around the middle 50s on the Fahrenheit scale, all year round. But a large, enclosed, interconnected underground space is a different thing entirely. A great volume of sheltered air deep in the earth, cut off from the surface, can develop its own slow internal climate. It can hold warmth, the heat of slowly decaying organic matter, the steady warmth of the deep rock itself, the simple accumulation of sealed air over very long periods. All of it can give a large underground system a noticeably different feel from a small lonely cave. So the warm air in the accounts is not proof of anything, but it is consistent with one specific possibility. It is consistent with the passages being not isolated little pockets, but parts of something much larger, something connected, something with its own breath. So let us step back and ask the question that the whole story keeps circling, the one we have been deliberately leaving unanswered. Why? Why would anyone build, or shape, or maintain a network of passages through these mountains. What on earth would it be for? And here for once we're on solid ground, because the answer is not strange at all. It is profoundly human. Consider, first, the simplest reason: travel. The Smokies sit astride the great spine of the southern Appalachians, and crossing them on the surface is hard. You either climb the high, exposed ridges, battered by weather, in plain sight of anyone watching, or you wind slowly along the deep creek valleys, a long and indirect path. But a passage through the mountain, at a steady depth, sheltered from the weather, hidden from above, would offer something precious to a people moving goods and messages across that barrier: a shortcut, a secret road, a way through the wall instead of over it. And if that sounds far-fetched, if some part of you wants to say that ancient people simply did not build things like that, then let me gently remind you of what people have built, all over the world, with nothing but patience and skill and the will to do it. In the deserts of the Middle East and Central Asia thousands of years ago, people dug vast networks of underground channels to carry water from the mountains to the dry lowlands, channels that ran for many miles beneath the surface, so well made that some of them still carry water to this day, after 2,000 years. In the Andes of South America, the builders of great empires carved roads and storehouses and passages across an impossibly rugged landscape, infrastructure that let them move armies and goods across the mountains regardless of the weather above. The Romans tunneled through hills for their water and their armies and their rights. Underground construction is not some exotic, unbelievable feat reserved for a single civilization. It is one of the oldest and most widespread things that organized human communities do. They go down. They always have. So the genuinely strange thing about the Smoky Mountains is not the idea that people might have built passages there. The genuinely strange thing is that, alone among such places, no one has ever bothered to seriously check. But travel and trade are only half of the why, and probably not even the deepest half. Because for the native peoples of this continent, the underground was never only a practical space. It was sacred. It was a threshold. It was the boundary between the ordinary world of daylight and the older, deeper world beneath, where the rules were different and the powers were greater. This is not a Smoky Mountains peculiarity. It is a pattern so consistent across the Americas that its absence would be more surprising than its presence. In the southwest, the Pueblo peoples built their kivas, round chambers set partly into the earth, as the spiritual heart of their communities, a place to descend into for the most important ceremonies. Far to the south, the Maya regarded certain caves and the deep natural wells they called cenotes as literal entrances to the underworld, sacred and dangerous, used for ceremony and offering for thousands of years. Again and again, across cultures that never met, the same idea recurs. The underground is not just another room, it is a different kind of place, with its own laws, its own inhabitants, and its own power. And this is where the practical and the sacred stop being separate explanations and become a single one, because a passage that was both a route and a holy place would be doubly protected, doubly remembered, doubly maintained. The sacred reasons would keep the knowledge alive across the generations, guarded and handed down with care, long after a purely practical road would have been forgotten. And the practical reality of actually walking through the mountain, in the dark, with the whole weight of the stone above you, and the sound of unseen water somewhere ahead, would have given the sacred ideas their power in the first place. Think about what that experience would actually be. To move through solid rock, to feel the temperature change, to hear your own breath in a silence older than your people. That is not an ordinary human experience. It changes your sense of your own smallness, your sense of the age and the weight of the world. The people who regularly went into such places did not invent their reverence out of nothing. The underground earned it. The metaphors did not come first and then get attached to a cave. The cave came first, and the metaphors grew up around what it was actually like to be inside it. And then there is the water, which ties so much of this together. Several versions of the old traditions describe the underground passages as following water, underground streams and rivers flowing through the mountains in the dark, and this too is geologically sound, which is the thing that keeps stopping you from dismissing it. In the seams and softer bands within this kind of rock, groundwater does not spread out evenly. It gathers and runs in concentrated channels, real underground streams that feed the countless springs bubbling out across the surface of the Smokies. A passage that followed such a stream would have a natural floor, natural drainage, and a natural route already carved by the water through the path of least resistance. To make a usable passage, you would not have to carve through solid rock from scratch. You would only have to follow what the water had already begun, and enlarge it, and smooth it. This is in fact more or less how those ancient desert water channels were made. You follow the water knows the way, and where there is water in the dark there is life. The accounts speak of it. Strange fish in the underground streams, pale, blind salamanders, bats in great numbers, and here, once again, the legends and the science quietly shake hands. Because the Smoky Mountains are one of the great strongholds of salamander life on the entire planet, so rich in them that biologists have sometimes called this region the salamander capital of the world. And the Appalachian cave systems are home to a whole hidden cast of creatures that have evolved over countless generations in total darkness. Cave crayfish, cave salamanders, pale, eyeless things that have never needed sight, found in only a handful of secret places. If there are genuine underground waterways threading through these mountains, then exactly the kind of strange, specialized ghostly animals the old stories describe are exactly what you would expect to find living in them. It is not proof, but it is, once again, consistent. The legend keeps describing a world, and the world keeps turning out to be possible. The bats are worth pausing on, because they offer something the rest of the story rarely does, a way to test it. Bats that gather in large numbers need real space. A passage that could shelter a great colony would have to be sizable, with enough volume, enough airflow, and enough connection to the open sky for the animals to pour out at dusk to feed. And a major emergence of bats is not a subtle thing. At twilight, they rise from the mouth of their roost in a great living cloud, thousands upon thousands of them, spiralling up into the dimming sky. It is one of the most memorable sights in nature, the kind of thing that any people living nearby would notice and remember and pass down, which means that the locations of the great bat roosts would have been written into the geographic memory of the mountains as surely as the rivers and the ridges. And here is the quietly hopeful part. The places where bats gathered in large numbers were, in more recent times, documented by wildlife biologists. So in theory, you could lay the map of the known great roosts over the map of the places named in the old stories, and see whether they line up. It is a thread no one has fully pulled. Sadly, it has grown harder to pull, because in recent years a terrible disease has swept through the bats of the eastern mountains and devastated their numbers. But the old records remain. The comparison could still be made. The lead is still there, waiting, like so many others, for someone to follow it. We should also be honest about time, because time does not only hide things, it also breaks them. If a network of passages truly runs beneath these mountains, it is almost certainly not in the condition it was when it was last used. These mountains, though far quieter than the restless ranges of the west, do shudder now and then. The earth here moves, occasionally, and over thousands of years even occasional movement adds up. Sections collapse. Entrances are buried under rockfall and become invisible. New cracks open in places that were once solid. The forest grows over old openings and hides them. Rivers shift their courses and seal one door while slowly opening another. So even if a research team set out tomorrow, armed with every old account and every line of the oral tradition, and went straight to the places described, they might find nothing but a wall of fallen stone where a door once stood. The landscape itself has changed. The map is old. Some of the things it points to may simply not be reachable anymore, and some new openings, created by collapse and erosion in the long years since, might lead into the network from places no story ever mentioned, places no one has thought to look. The mountain has been quietly rearranging its own secrets the whole time. Which brings us to the oldest question of all, the one we have circled and never landed on. If there is something down there, who made it, and when? And here, I cannot give you an answer, because no one can. But I can give you the possibilities, laid out gently like stones across a stream. The first possibility reaches almost unimaginably far back. The first human beings came into these mountains a very long time ago in the cold centuries after the last ice age, following the animals and the water and the good stone for their tools. They were not simple people. They were brilliant survivors, with an intimate knowledge of the land. If natural passages already existed, and they did, then those first people would surely have known them and used them, for shelter, for safety, for the deep human comfort of a roof of stone in a dangerous world. Any small changes they made would be nearly impossible to find now, erased by the tens of thousands of years that followed. So one possibility is that the story begins almost at the very beginning, with the first people simply moving into hollows the mountain had already made. A second possibility comes later, in the long Middle Ages of this continent's human story, the time when the great trade networks were taking shape and the mica was beginning to flow outward across the land. As the demand for the shimmering stone grew, the surface deposits would have run dry, and the digging would have gone deeper, and the underground workings would have grown. In this telling, the passages are, at heart, mines. Practical, ambitious, expanding works of extraction, shaped and connected over generations of patient labour, that grew into something larger than any single mine because the people kept following the seams and kept needing more. And the third possibility brings us nearly to our own doorstep. It is that much of what is down there is the work of the Cherokee themselves, or their more recent ancestors, over the last 1,000 years or more. They had the skill, they had the organisation, they had the deep, sacred relationship with the underground that would have given them every reason to invest in it. And in this telling, the Nunnehi, the immortal people of the underground towns, might be something hauntingly simple. They might be a memory. The memory of a real project, a real network, built by real people in one age, and slowly transformed in the retelling, generation after generation, into the work of a beautiful and mysterious other people who lived in the dark below. It would not be the first time a culture turned the great deeds of its own distant ancestors into legend. It happens everywhere. It may have happened here. The most likely truth, if we are honest, is probably not one of those three alone, but all of them braided together. Natural passages, found and used by the first people, widened and extended over thousands of years as mines and roads, and woven finally into the sacred geography and the living memory of the Cherokee, who knew them, used them, and held their story. A thing that grew, layer upon layer, the way the mountain itself grew, until no single age could claim it. But I have to keep saying the honest words because they matter. This is the most plausible picture we can draw from incomplete evidence. It is not a confirmed account of what happened. It is a careful guess in the dark. The difference between those two things is the whole reason this remains a mystery and not a chapter in a textbook. There is a darker turn in this story, and it deserves to be told gently because it touches real suffering. In the 1800s, the Cherokee people were torn from these mountains, forced from the land they had lived in for thousands of years and driven west, on the long and terrible march that history remembers as the Trail of Tears. Thousands died. It was one of the great wounds in the history of this continent, and yet a small number of Cherokee managed to remain, hidden in the folds of these very mountains, holding on through a combination of luck and law and sheer refusal to leave. Their descendants are still here today, the eastern band of Cherokee Indians living beside the national park on land that was never fully taken from them. And there is a thread in the oral tradition, quiet and hard to verify, that says that during those darkest years, when soldiers were hunting people out of their homes, some took refuge in the passages beneath the mountains, that the network was used to move unseen, to hide, to keep the scattered survivors in contact when the surface of the world had become too dangerous to cross. We cannot confirm those accounts. They may be literal memory. They may be the way a wounded people gave shape to an unbearable time, telling the story of survival through the oldest sacred image they had, the protecting dark of the mountain itself. But whether literal or symbolic, there is something important hidden inside them. Because if the passages were truly used to survive a time when discovery meant death, then there would have been a powerful life and death reason to keep their locations secret, to tell no one outside the most trusted circle. And a reason like that does not simply expire when the danger passes. It settles into a culture. It becomes a habit of protection, layered on top of the older sacred reasons for guarding such knowledge, which may be part of why, even now, the most specific knowledge of where these passages lie, if such knowledge still exists, is not something that has ever been laid out for the curious public. It is held, guarded, kept perhaps exactly as it has always been kept by the people who have the deepest right to keep it. And that, too, is part of why the mystery endures. Some of the answer may not be lost at all. It may simply not be ours to ask for carelessly. So what would it actually take to finally know? The remarkable thing, The thing that turns this from a sad story into a hopeful one is that the tools to settle this question now exist. They did not used to. For most of the time this mystery has been around, there was simply no way to see into solid rock without digging. That is no longer true. In recent years, a technology called LiDAR, which scans the land with countless pulses of laser light from the air, has transformed the search for hidden history. It can see through the forest canopy and reveal the bare shape of the ground beneath, exposing old features that human eyes walking right over them would never notice. Related tools can probe beneath the surface, hunting for the empty spaces that passages would leave in the rock. A patient, systematic survey of these mountains with the best of this technology, focused on the places the old accounts describe, would produce something this mystery has never once had in all its long life. Real data. A genuine map of where the hollow places are and whether any of them are too straight, too regular, too connected to be the work of water alone. But technology alone would not be enough, and it should not be, because the deepest knowledge here does not live in any machine. It lives with the people who have carried it the longest, and that changes everything about how a real search would have to happen. In recent decades, the law and the culture around native heritage in this country have shifted, slowly and not nearly enough, but genuinely. Native communities now have a real voice in what happens to places of cultural meaning on public land, including the national park. The Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians has formal standing to be consulted about such work, and the most meaningful version of this investigation would not be a team of outsiders descending on the mountains to dig up someone else's heritage. It would be a true partnership, a project built together with the Cherokee community on terms they found acceptable, respecting what they choose to share and what they choose to keep, guided by the knowledge that they, and only they, have held across all these generations. That kind of partnership is not just the right way to do it, it is the most powerful way, because the community's own knowledge, if shared, would be worth more than any laser scan. It would tell the searchers not just how to look, but where. And yet, with all of that within reach, the tools, the legal path, the possibility of partnership, it still has not happened. Why? The answer is almost disappointingly ordinary, and that ordinariness is itself the final quiet villain of this whole story. It comes down to priority, to will. The people whose job it would be to investigate something like this, the archaeologists, the institutions, the park itself, all operate with limited time and limited money, and a long list of questions already considered more respectable, more fundable, more safe. A question that arrives wrapped in legend, supported mostly by oral tradition, and old folklore and the unverified claims of amateurs, is a difficult thing to stake a career or a budget on. It needs a champion, someone with the standing to say, this is worth my reputation, and the stubbornness to see it through against the quiet pull of everyone else's doubt. That champion has not yet appeared, and so the question waits, not because it has been answered, and not because it is unanswerable, but simply because no one with the power to settle it has yet decided that it matters enough. There is something almost poetic and almost unbearable about that. The mystery has not survived because of some grand conspiracy to hide it. There is no secret order guarding the truth. What has kept the tunnels of the Smoky Mountains in the dark is something far more human and far more common. Neglect. The slow, accumulated weight of 100 small decisions to look elsewhere. The question fell into the gap between disciplines, too geological for the historians, too historical for the geologists, too tangled with legend for the scientists, too physical for the folklorists, owned by no one, and therefore pursued by no one. It is a strange thing to realise, lying here in the dark, that one of the most intriguing questions in the Eastern Mountains has remained open not because it is too hard, but because no one ever quite got around to it. The evidence has been waiting, patient as the stone, the whole time, and the evidence, while it waits, only grows. That is the part that should keep you wondering as you drift. Most questions, left alone, fade. The trail goes cold, the evidence crumbles, but this one has done the opposite. Each passing decade has added something. Another old account surfaces in a dusty archive. Another piece of the oral tradition is finally written down. The geology becomes better understood and keeps turning out to be capable of exactly the kind of thing the stories describe. The technology that could finally look grows sharper and cheaper and more available. The case does not weaken. It quietly strengthens year after year while the investigation that would settle it remains unmade. That is an unusual and unstable situation. It is the kind of situation that sooner or later tips. At some point, the weight of all that converging evidence will be too much for the silence to hold, and someone will finally go and look properly. It may be next year. It may be in the lifetime of someone not yet born. But the mountains are not going anywhere, and neither is the question. Let us drift a little further out now, away from the specific question of the tunnels, into the wider and stranger thing they point toward. Because the real reason this mystery matters is not only the tunnels themselves, it is what they would mean. The story we usually tell ourselves about the deep past of this continent is a thin and modest one. We tend to imagine the people who lived here before the Europeans came as small, scattered groups, living lightly, leaving little behind, each in their own valley, mostly unconnected to the rest. A few impressive exceptions are allowed, the great mound cities, the cliff dwellings, but they are treated as exceptions, as surprises, as departures from a simpler norm. The idea of something larger, an interconnected world, a continent laced together by trade and travel and shared knowledge and ambitious works of construction, sits oddly against that picture. It feels, somehow, like it belongs to the old world, to Egypt and Rome and Persia, and not to here. But that picture does not fit the evidence, and it never really did. The trade networks of ancient North America were not modest. They were continental. Copper from the great northern lakes travelled to the warm coasts of the far south. Shells from the distant oceans travelled deep into the heart of the land, thousands of miles from any shore. Stone from the mountains of the far west has been found in the earthworks of the eastern river valleys, and the shimmering mica of these very mountains, the Smokies, travelled out across half the continent to be laid in the graves and the ceremonies of distant peoples. These materials did not wander by accident. They moved through organised, sustained networks of exchange, involving many communities along reliable routes, kept open across hundreds of years. A network like that is not the work of simple, isolated bands. It is the work of a complex, interconnected human world, with agreements between peoples, with established routes and understood rules, with the organisation to move precious things across enormous distances, again and again, generation after generation. And the Smoky Mountains were not at the edge of that world. They were near its heart. They sat at the meeting point of routes that connected the Gulf Coast to the Great Lakes, the river valleys to the Eastern Sea. They were a crossroads, a hub in a continental web of exchange. So the question of how the people who lived at that crossroads managed it, what they built, what they knew, what infrastructure they raised to hold their place in that vast network, is not a small or marginal question at all. It is a question about the real shape of the human world that existed here, on this land, for thousands of years before it was renamed and remade. And the tunnels, if they are real, would be a piece of that answer. A piece of the hidden machinery that made a continent's worth of trade and travel and meaning actually work. They would ask us, quietly, to think a little bigger about what was here before us. Not to believe anything wild, just to take seriously the ordinary astonishing competence of the people who lived in these mountains for longer than most of recorded history has even existed. There is a thing that happens to your sense of yourself when you really absorb the age of all this. We move through landscapes as if they were simply backdrops, scenery, a place to do our brief business and move on. The dominant way of seeing the land in much of modern life is exactly that. We arrive, we use, we leave, and we imagine the land does not remember. But that is not how the people who lived here for thousands of years understood it, and it may not be true. There is a very different way of relating to a place, one rooted in the idea that the land carries the memory of those who lived on it, and that those who live on it carry a responsibility toward the land in return. A relationship that runs in both directions, across not years but generations. And that way of seeing produces something the modern way almost never does. It produces the willingness to invest in a place for a future you will not live to see. You do not carve a passage through a mountain and maintain it across centuries if you think of yourself as a visitor. You do that only if you understand yourself to be a permanent part of the place. If you are building for descendants you will never meet, in a home you believe will still be theirs long after you're gone. And there is something else. Something that gives me a quiet chill every time I sit with it. Of all the things that ancient people made, the underground ones are the most likely to survive. Think about that for a moment as you lie there. The houses they built are long gone. Wood and bark and hide return to the earth within a few short generations. Even the things they made of stone on the surface are worn by the rain, scattered by the seasons, buried and broken and lost. But a passage cut into hard rock, deep below the surface, sheltered from the weather, protected from the sun and the frost, and the patient erosion that destroys everything above, could endure almost unimaginably long, far longer than any building, far longer than any monument left in the open air. A well-made passage in this kind of stone hidden beneath these mountains could in principle survive essentially intact for 10,000 years, or more, long after the language of its builders had fallen silent, long after their names, their faces, their entire way of life had vanished from the memory of the world. The thing itself could simply remain, waiting, in the dark. Let yourself imagine, just for a moment, what it would be to find such a place. To follow a passage into the mountain, your light moving over the walls, and to come upon a surface that hands had smoothed, a threshold someone had shaped, a space that human beings had made for human purposes, in an age before any city anywhere in the world had been built, before writing existed, before any of the stories we tell about the human past had even begun. To stand inside it, to touch a wall that someone had touched, and worked, and finished, when the Great Pyramids were not yet imagined, and the first villages of the distant old world were only just being dreamed. That would not be like reading history in a book. It would not be like standing behind glass in a museum. It would be like reaching back through 10,000 years and, for one impossible moment, almost touching the hand that did the work. That is what may be waiting beneath these mountains. Not treasure, not gold. Something far rarer than gold. A door, left open, into the deep and unwritten human past of this land. And whether anyone ever walks through that door in our lifetimes or in some far-off year, the deeper invitation of this whole story remains the same, and it is something worth carrying with you into sleep. It is simply this. The surface of things is not all of things. Every tradition of human wisdom that has ever lasted contains some version of that understanding, that what lies beneath is at least as real and at least as important as what lies on top, that the world we walk across so confidently is only the thin-lit roof of something vast and old and patient underneath. The people who lived in these mountains the longest knew this, not as a metaphor, but as a fact about the ground they stood on. They knew the mountains breathed the blue haze of the living forest into the morning air. And they said, in one form or another, across all the long years, that the mountains breathed in another way too, through openings in the rock where the air moved wrong, where the temperature did not match the season, where the sound that came up out of the dark was not the wind in the trees, but something older, something from much further down. We have not yet taken that claim seriously enough to find out whether it is true. That is the strange, sad, hopeful heart of it. Not that we looked and found nothing, but that we have, for the most part, simply never looked at all. The mist still gathers in the valleys every morning and rises through the day. The ridges still stand as they have stood for longer than the mind can hold, keeping whatever they keep with the perfect patience of stone. The most visited mountains in the country, walked by millions of feet every year, and beneath those feet, perhaps, a layer of human history we have not yet found the will to reach. The answer is not gone. It has not crumbled to dust. It is down there in the cool and the quiet and the dark, as patient as the rock itself, waiting, as it has waited for so very long, for someone at last to bring a light. There is one quality that runs through nearly all the old accounts, and it is the thing that, in the end, I find hardest to set aside. It is surprise. Every person who left one of these scattered notes, the surveyor, the settler, the hunter, the traveller, was surprised by what they found. They were not looking for it. They had no theory to prove, no story they were trying to tell, no audience to impress. They simply came upon something they could not explain, and they paused, and because it struck them as strange and somehow important, they wrote it down, almost in spite of themselves, in the margins of some other errand. And that, in the strange arithmetic of evidence, makes them the most trustworthy witnesses of all. People who are building a case shape their stories to fit it. People who are merely startled by something real do not. They just describe what they saw and move on, puzzled, never knowing that in another valley in another decade someone else was being puzzled by the very same thing. That quiet, scattered, unconnected surprise, repeating across 2 centuries, is not the signature of a legend being passed around and embellished. It is the signature of many separate people, independently, bumping into something that was actually there. And there is something fitting, almost beautiful, in the way this knowledge has survived. It did not survive in the grand institutions. It was not preserved in the great libraries or settled in the textbooks or honoured with the attention of the experts. It survived the way the passages themselves are said to survive, scattered, hidden, connecting unlikely points across a difficult landscape, refusing the obvious routes, requiring patience and care to follow, held together not by any central authority, but by the simple stubbornness of people who would not let it disappear. The Cherokee elders who carried the oral tradition through the worst years their people ever knew, the settlers who jotted down what they could not understand, the curious locals and the amateur searchers who spent their own time and their own money chasing a question no institution would fund, the folklorists who thought an old woman's memory was worth writing down, all of them working separately across the years, keeping the shape of the mystery alive when the proper guardians of knowledge had turned away. The knowledge survived in the margins, exactly as the network is said to run through the margins of the rock, and perhaps that is the most honest place for it to have lived all this time, out at the edges, in the keeping of the people who simply refuse to forget. The mountains of the southern Appalachians have been home to human beings for longer than almost any of the famous civilizations of the ancient world even existed. The first people came into these valleys before the pyramids of Egypt were raised, before the first cities of the old world were built, before writing had been invented anywhere on the planet. They came into a landscape that was already unimaginably ancient, and they made it their home, and they passed it down, one generation handing it to the next, for a span of time so long that every empire you have ever heard of would fit inside it many times over. The Cherokee who met the Europeans were not the first people of these mountains. They were the most recent of a long, long line, each generation inheriting the land and some portion of the knowledge of those who came before, layer upon layer upon layer, like the rock itself. And if there is a network beneath these mountains, it is almost certainly older than any of the names we can put to it. It may have been begun by people whose language is utterly lost, whose faces we will never see, whose entire world survives now only in scattered stone tools and the faint, patient traces they left in the earth. What those people made, if they made it, has very likely outlasted them completely. The builders are gone. The tongue in which they spoke of their work is gone. The world that gave it meaning is gone, replaced by other worlds, which were themselves replaced again and again down all the long centuries. And yet the thing itself, if it is there, simply remains, in the dark, in the quiet, in the deep, cool heart of the oldest mountains in the east, untouched by the storms of all that history, holding its shape with a patience that makes every human lifetime look like the briefest flicker of light. There is a kind of vertigo in that thought, the good kind, the kind that loosens your grip on the small worries of the day and lets you feel, just for a moment, the true and enormous scale of the world you're a tiny, temporary, fortunate part of. Let that feeling carry you now. You're a small, warm light, awake for a little while, in a world far older and far deeper than you will ever fully know. And there is nothing frightening in that at all. There is only rest. There will come a morning, perhaps not soon, when someone finally goes. Picture it softly as you drift. A team walks into these mountains with the right tools and the right questions, and, most important of all, the right relationships with the people who know this land best. They will not arrive with shovels and certainty. They will arrive with patience and with permission and with humility. They will scan the ridges from the air and read the hidden shape of the ground. They will go to the places the old stories named and to the new places the machines reveal, and they will look carefully at what is actually there. And whatever they find, it will not be a sudden cinematic moment of discovery. Real discoveries almost never are. It will be slow, methodical, a thing measured and photographed and checked again, argued over, written up, and only gradually understood. It may take years to interpret. It may take decades to truly absorb into the larger story of who was here and what they built, but it will happen. The evidence is too convergent. The question is too specific. The mountains are too clearly capable of holding what the stories describe. Sooner or later, the looking will be done, and when it is, all the people who kept this question alive will, in a quiet way, have been part of it. The the elders who carried the tradition through displacement and loss, the strangers who scribbled their puzzlement in the margins of old letters, the amateurs who spent their weekends in the wilderness, chasing something no one would pay them to find, the ones who simply listened and refused to let the question fade. The story of how the secret beneath the Smoky Mountains was finally brought into the light, whenever that story is written, will be a story about patience and persistence, and the deep human refusal to let a real question disappear into silence just because the people who should have answered it looked away. And there is something quietly wonderful in realizing that you, lying here in the dark tonight, listening to all of this drift past you on the edge of sleep, are now part of that long chain too. You have heard the question. You have found it worth wondering about. You have carried the shape of the mystery forward, one more night into the world. That is a small thing. But small things, repeated across enough people and enough years, are exactly how a question survives long enough to finally be answered. So that is the story of the tunnels beneath the Smoky Mountains. Not a story with an ending, because it does not have one yet. A story still open, still waiting, still resting in the dark beneath the most visited mountains in the country, as patient as it has always been. We did not solve it tonight. No one has solved it yet. But that was never really the point. The point was the going down. The point was to follow a real question, gently, into the deep, and to feel on the way the true age of the world and the long presence of the people who lived here before us, and the strange comfort of a mystery that has held its ground for so very long against both the ones who would dismiss it and the ones who would believe too much, too easily. Some mysteries deserve to be respected exactly as they are, held lightly, wondered about, left open, like a door, until the day someone is ready to walk through. The blue smoke will rise over these mountains again tomorrow morning, as it has every morning for longer than anyone can remember. The mist will gather in the valleys and lift through the trees and turn the distances soft and blue. The ridges will stand where they have always stood, and somewhere beneath them, in the cool and the quiet and the ancient dark, whatever is down there will go on waiting, with the endless patience of stone for the question to be asked at last the way it deserves to be asked. Maybe in your lifetime, maybe in a lifetime not yet begun. The mountains do not mind. They have waited so long already. A little longer is nothing to them at all. And now, as the night settles fully around you, let us let the mystery soften and recede. The way the ridges soften into the blue haze of the morning, there is nothing more you need to hold on to tonight. No fact you need to remember. No answer you need to reach. The whole point of a question like this one is that it asks nothing of you in return. It is simply a place to rest your mind, somewhere old and deep and quiet, while the rest of you lets go. So let it go now. Let the surveyors and the settlers and the elders and the searchers fade gently into the dark. Let the passages and the warm air and the shimmering mica and the underground streams drift away like mist lifting from a valley. Let the mountains hold the question, the way they have always held it, so that you do not have to. If some part of this kept your mind drifting softly in the right direction tonight, you can let the channel know with the smallest of gestures. A quiet tap on the like button, if you feel like it. Just a soft signal in the dark that more journeys like this one would be welcome. And if you would like to keep wandering through the hidden histories of the world on nights like this, you might subscribe, so the next one finds you when you need it. There is no rush. These videos will keep being here, waiting in the quiet for whenever you come looking. And before you go all the way under, if you are still even a little awake, I would still love to know where you are. Leave a comment and tell me, what corner of the world are you listening from tonight? What time is it where you lie? Is it the deep middle of the night, or the early grey before dawn, or some quiet evening hour with the lamp turned low? Are there mountains outside your window, or a city, or the wide dark of the countryside, or just the ordinary walls of a room that has become for tonight your own small shelter against the bigness of the world? Tell me where you are, because every place that appears in those comments adds another point to a quiet map, a map of all of us scattered across the whole turning planet, awake or drifting in our separate corners, drawn for our own reasons to the same questions in the same late hours. That is its own kind of network, you know, its own kind of connection across great distances between people who will never meet. Not so very different when you think about it, from the old routes that crossed these mountains thousands of years ago, linking distant people through the dark, carrying something precious from one far place to another. We're still doing it. We're doing it right now, you and I, and everyone else listening tonight. Connected across the miles by nothing more than a voice in the dark and a shared and gentle curiosity about the world. So rest now. You have come a long way down tonight, into the deep history of an old, old place, and you have earned the quiet at the bottom of it. The mountains are still out there, holding their secrets with a patience that will outlast every one of us, and there is something deeply restful in that. You do not have to solve anything. You do not have to carry anything. The questions will keep, the answers will keep. The stone has waited tens of thousands of years already, and it will wait a little longer without you while you sleep. Let your breathing slow. Let the weight settle out of your shoulders, out of your hands, out of the small muscles around your eyes. Imagine, if it helps you drift, that you're sinking gently downward, the way mist sinks into a valley at the end of the day, down past the roots of the great trees, down past the cool, dark soil, down into the patient stone, into a quiet so old and so deep that nothing up above can reach it. There is no fear down here, only stillness, only rest, only the slow, ancient calm of a mountain that has seen everything and forgotten nothing and holds it all, gently in the dark. The blue smoke rises over the Smokies every single morning, soft and silent, the breath of the living forest curling up into the light. And somewhere far beneath it, the oldest questions of these mountains wait, patient and unhurried for a day that may yet come. But that day is not tonight. Tonight there is only you, and the quiet and the deep, slow breathing of the world. Thank you for spending this stretch of the dark with me. It means more than you know. Rest easy now wherever you are in your own small pool of warmth and quiet. Let the mountains keep their secrets. Let the night carry you the rest of the way. Sleep well. Sleep deeply, and good night.